The click of the door closing on her 14-year marriage was the quietest, most violent sound Haylee Shaw had ever heard. One moment she was the respected wife of real estate titan Daniel Shaw, the silent partner and design genius behind his architectural empire. The next, she was being replaced by a woman half her age with a name made for headlines and a soul made of glass. Daniel didn't just leave her, he erased her, taking credit for her life's work and flaunting his new prize crystal all over the city. He thought he had left Haylee with nothing. He thought he had won, but he made one critical mistake. He forgot that true brilliance can't be extinguished, only hidden. And tonight at the city's most exclusive gala, he's about to watch the woman he discarded shine brighter than he could ever imagine in the arms of a man who owns the world Daniel only dreams of conquering. The silence in the sprawling minimalist penthouse on Park Avenue was a new kind of heavy. It wasn't the peaceful quiet Haylee had once cherished after a long day of drafting blueprints. It was a hollow, echoing void where a life used to be. For 14 years, that life had been intertwined with Daniel Shaw. They were a power couple or so, the magazine said. Daniel, the charismatic deal-maker with a smile that could sell swampland in winter, and Haylee, the brilliant, unassuming architect who turned his generic steel and glass ambitions into breathtaking, award-winning realities. Her signature was on every one of his landmark buildings, not on the plaques, but in the very soul of the structures. She was the one who spent sleepless nights obsessing over the way light would filter through an atrium at dawn, the precise curvature of a grand staircase, the seamless integration of green space into an urban jungle. Daniel sold the dream, but Haylee built it. He got the cover of Forbes. She got a quiet satisfaction that for a time had been enough. The end came not with a bang, but with a series of cuttingly casual remarks. "We need a more youthful brand identity," he'd said one evening, scrolling through his phone, not even looking at her. "Someone with social media synergy." A week later, Crystal thinks we should leverage influencers for the Hudson Yards project. Crystal. The name sounded like cheap champagne, an effervescent burst of something fleeting and artificial. Haylee had seen her first on Instagram, a 24-year-old with impossibly white teeth and a vacant stare posing on the yet-to-be-completed balcony of the Shaw Tower, their tower. Haylee's masterpiece. The project she had bled for the culmination of a decade of her design philosophy. In the photo, Crystal was wearing a ridiculously small bikini and one of Daniel's custom-tailored suit jackets, a glass of rosé in her hand. The caption read, "The King and His New Castle. So proud of my man's vision. Power couple #NYC Real Estate #Living the Dream." The divorce proceedings were a masterclass in humiliation. Daniel's legal team, led by the notoriously ruthless Martin Webb, painted Haylee as a discontented housewife with expensive hobbies. They systematically dismantled her contributions, framing her architectural work as preliminary sketches and spousal support. Every blueprint she presented, every design document with her annotations, was dismissed as collaborative input, generously permitted by the true visionary Daniel Shaw. The prenuptial agreement she'd signed in a haze of love and trust 20 years ago was wielded like a weapon, leaving her with a fraction of the fortune she had helped build. She was forced to leave the penthouse she had designed, every line and texture a reflection of her own spirit. She moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Greenwich Village, the kind of place they might have rented as struggling newlyweds. Except now she was alone, pushing 45, with a portfolio of work that officially belonged to another man. The months that followed were a blur of gray. The society friends who had once clamored for invitations to her dinner parties now crossed the street to avoid her. She was a ghost in a city that had once felt like her own. The real torture, however, was digital. Crystal's social media was a constant glittering assault. Pictures of her and Daniel on private jets at exclusive resorts, and always in front of buildings Haylee had designed. Crystal would pose coquettishly by the serpentine glass wall of the Orion Center, a feature Haylee had fought tooth and nail for, and caption it, "My baby is such a genius. He sees the world in curves, not corners." Each post was a fresh stab of betrayal. Daniel wasn't just moving on, He was actively rewriting history with Crystal as his vapid blonde co-author. He was stealing her past while flaunting his future. Haylee deleted her social media accounts, but the stories still found her through well-meaning but pitying calls from her few remaining friends. One rainy Tuesday, her lawyer, a kind but weary woman named Susan, called with the final settlement papers. "It's done, Haylee," she said, her voice laced with apology. "He's keeping the firm, the branding, the copyrights to all past projects. It's airtight." That night, Haylee sat on the floor of her new, empty living room, a cardboard box of her old drafting tools beside her. She pulled out a faded photograph from years ago. It was the groundbreaking ceremony for their first major project, a boutique hotel in Soho. In the photo, she and Daniel stood side by side, both in hard hats, their faces beaming with shared pride. He had his arm around her, and he was looking at her, not the camera, with an expression of genuine awe. Where did that man go? When had the awe curdled into resentment and then into contempt? She realized now that her quiet competence hadn't supported him. It had threatened him. The more accolades her designs received, the more he felt like an imposter in his own life. Crystal was the perfect antidote. She was a mirror reflecting his own perceived greatness back at him, asking for nothing but the light he cast. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. The grief was immense, a physical weight in her chest. But as she stared at the photo, something else flickered to life within the cold ashes of her despair. It was a tiny, defiant spark. He had taken her name, her home, her history. But he couldn't take her talent. That was hers. It lived in her hands, in her mind, in the way she saw the world. And as she packed the photo away, she made a quiet vow. He would not be the final word in her story. The echo of a shattered life was deafening, but she would learn to build a new sound in its place. The first 6 months were the hardest. The name Haylee Shaw was now inextricably linked to a messy public divorce. Potential clients were hesitant. To them, she was either a victim to be pitied or a scorned woman to be avoided. The name that once connoted elegance and innovative design now whispered of scandal. So she made a change. She founded a small independent firm under her maiden name, Haylee Vance Design. It felt both like a retreat and a declaration of war. Her office was a cramped second-floor walk-up in Chelsea with a temperamental radiator and a window that looked out onto a brick wall. It was a far cry from the sweeping corner office overlooking Central Park she once occupied. Her first employee was Penelope, a sharp-witted, fiercely loyal draftswoman who had quit Shaw Corp the day Haylee's departure was announced, stating she refused to work for a credit-stealing egomaniac with terrible taste in arm candy. Penelope, with her fire-engine red hair and even fierier loyalty, became Haylee's one-woman support system. Their first projects were humbling. A kitchen remodel in Brooklyn for a young couple who paid them partly in homemade sourdough. A lobby redesign for a dentist's office in Queens that had a budget smaller than Daniel's weekly wine allowance. Haylee poured the same meticulous detail and creative energy into these small spaces as she had into skyscrapers. She found a quiet joy in the work, a satisfaction that was wholly her own. She wasn't just designing spaces. She was rebuilding her own foundation, brick by painful brick. She learned to be lean, resourceful. She negotiated with suppliers herself, hauled material samples on the subway, and worked late into the night fueled by cheap coffee and Penelope's unwavering belief in her. "This dentist's lobby is going to be a temple of oral hygiene," Penelope would declare, taping up swatches. "People will come from miles around just to floss in a space this well designed." Slowly, word of mouth began to spread. The Brooklyn couple's kitchen was featured on a popular design blog. The dentist reported a surprising uptick in new patients who all commented on the calming, beautiful waiting room. Small commissions started to trickle in: a brownstone renovation, a small art gallery layout, a rooftop garden design. Each project was a victory, a small piece of her identity reclaimed. Meanwhile, Daniel and Crystal continued their public spectacle. Shaw Corp announced a new audacious project, Elysian, a hypermodern luxury residential tower that promised to redefine the skyline. The press releases were filled with Daniel's pompous quotes about his singular vision and disruptive approach to urban living. Crystal was named brand ambassador, and her Instagram was a fire hose of behind-the-scenes content mostly featuring her trying on hard hats over perfectly coiffed hair. Haylee saw the initial renderings online. They were cold, ostentatious, and derivative. It was all flash and no substance, a desperate attempt to mimic the style she had cultivated but without any of the underlying principles. It looked like a caricature of her work stripped of its soul. For the first time, she didn't feel a pang of loss. She felt a flicker of professional disdain. He was lost without her eye, and it was beginning to show. One evening, while working late on the plans for the art gallery, Penelope slid a thick cream-colored envelope across Haylee's drafting table. "This came by courier," she said, her voice neutral. The envelope was embossed with a stylized phoenix rising from flames. It was an invitation to the annual Phoenix Foundation Charity Ball, the undisputed pinnacle of New York's social calendar. It was an event she and Daniel had chaired 2 years in a row. Seeing the familiar crest felt like a ghost brushing against her skin. They must have sent it to the old address and it got forwarded. Haylee murmured, her finger tracing the raised emblem. She was about to toss it into the recycling bin. "Or," Penelope said, leaning against the table, "they sent it to you. Haylee Vance, the emerging designer who is getting quiet but significant buzz for her integrity and talent." Haylee laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Penny, be realistic. I'm not on that list anymore. I'm a social leper. Besides, why would I want to go? To stand in a room full of people who watched my life implode and whispered about it over champagne. To see him." The thought of facing Daniel and Crystal, of seeing the pity in the eyes of her former peers, made her stomach clench. She had spent the better part of a year making herself small, invisible. The gala was the brightest, most unforgiving spotlight imaginable. Penelope picked up the invitation. "That's exactly why you should go," she said, her tone serious. "You've been hiding in the studio doing incredible work in the shadows. Haylee, you're not a victim. You're a survivor. And it's time you stopped letting him define the narrative. This isn't about him. This is about you. Go there, hold your head high, and let them see that Haylee Vance is not just surviving. She's building something new. Besides," she added with a sly grin, "every major developer, architect, and philanthropist in the city will be there. It's not a party, it's the best networking opportunity of the year. And you, my friend, deserve a night to wear something other than black turtlenecks and trade show lanyards." Haylee looked around her small, cluttered office. The walls were covered in sketches, fabric samples, and wood finishes. It was a space born of her own resilience. It was hers. Penelope was right. Hiding was a choice, and she was tired of making it. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but for the first time it was accompanied by something else, a flicker of resolve. "Okay," Haylee said, the word feeling foreign and powerful on her tongue. "Okay, I'll go." Penelope beamed. "Good. Now we have a more pressing matter. We need to find you a dress that says, 'My ex-husband is a footnote, not the whole story.'" The week leading up to the Phoenix Foundation Ball was a strange mix of anxiety and exhilaration. Haylee felt like a soldier preparing for battle. The dress was her armor, the invitation her summons. Penelope, who appointed herself Chief of Operations for Operation Phoenix, was relentless. "No black," she declared, vetoing Haylee's initial safe choices. "Black is for mourning. We are celebrating a resurrection." After a grueling day of shopping that left Haylee emotionally drained, they found it in a small tucked-away boutique that specialized in independent designers. It was a gown of deep emerald silk that seemed to drink the light. It was deceptively simple, a classic clean-lined silhouette with a high neck, long sleeves, and a column skirt that flowed to the floor. Its only adornment was an intricate asymmetrical pleating across the bodice that resembled the folded wing of a bird. It was understated, elegant, and fiercely sophisticated. It was everything Crystal's style was not. It was, in a word, Haylee. "That's the one," Penelope whispered, her eyes shining. It doesn't scream for attention. It commands it. The night of the gala, a cold autumn wind whipped through the streets of Manhattan. Haylee stood before the full-length mirror in her small apartment bedroom, the silk of the dress cool against her skin. She had styled her hair in a simple, elegant chignon, and her only jewelry was a pair of vintage diamond and emerald earrings her grandmother had left her. They were her something old. The dress was her something new. Her reflection was of a woman she was only just getting to know. The past year had etched new lines around her eyes, but they weren't lines of defeat. They were lines of resilience. The uncertainty that had clouded her gaze for so long was replaced by a quiet, steady determination. She looked strong. The wave of panic she had been holding at bay crested. What was she doing? This was a mistake. She could just stay home, order takeout, and pretend the invitation never arrived. Her hand trembled as she reached for her clutch. Just then, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Penelope. "Remember the brief, you are not Haylee Shaw, the ex-wife. You are Haylee Vance, the future. Go make them stare. And for God's sake, grab a free glass of the good champagne." A small smile touched Haylee's lips. She took a deep, steadying breath, squared her shoulders, and walked out the door. The gala was held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the sprawling Temple of Dender. The room was a breathtaking spectacle of power and wealth. Towering floral arrangements reached towards the ceiling, casting fragrant shadows on the ancient stone walls. The air hummed with the sound of a string quartet clinking glasses and the low murmur of 1,000 conversations. Haylee handed her coat to an attendant and paused at the top of the grand staircase, her heart hammering against her ribs. The room was a sea of familiar faces, faces that had graced the society pages alongside hers and Daniel's for years. She saw them now clustered in their glittering groups, their eyes flicking over the new arrivals. She could feel their gazes, sense the whispers starting like a ripple in a pond. Is that Haylee Shaw? What is she doing here? She descended the stairs, her steps measured and deliberate, her eyes fixed straight ahead. She would not falter. She would not hide. She navigated her way to the bar, ordered a glass of champagne as Penelope had instructed, and found a relatively quiet spot near one of the massive windows overlooking the illuminated obelisk. She held the cool glass, its stem a fragile anchor in a churning sea of anxiety. She felt a presence beside her. "Haylee, my God, is that you?" She turned to see Beatrice Wallace, a woman whose charity committees she had once served, on her face a mask of poorly concealed shock. "Beatrice," Haylee said, her voice smoother than she expected. "How lovely to see you. Well, we all wondered where you'd gone," Beatrice said, her eyes darting around as if expecting Daniel to materialize. "You look well, very well." The subtext was clear. You look well for someone whose life was publicly dismantled. "I've been working," Haylee replied simply. "I started my own design firm, Vance Design." "Oh, how quaint," Beatrice said, the word dripping with condescension. Before Haylee could respond, Beatrice's eyes widened, looking over Haylee's shoulder towards the entrance. "Oh, look, there they are. Don't they just make the most divine couple?" Haylee didn't need to turn. A palpable shift had occurred in the room's energy. The volume of chatter dipped and then rose again, buzzing with a new frequency. A path seemed to clear through the crowd as if by magnetic force. She steeled herself and finally turned to look. Daniel Shaw had arrived, and on his arm was Crystal. They made an entrance designed to be photographed. Daniel was immaculate in a custom Tom Ford tuxedo, his silvering temples lending him a distinguished air that belied his predatory nature. He radiated an aura of success, his smile broad, and practiced his hand possessively on the small of Crystal's back. Crystal was a spectacle in scarlet. Her dress was a confection of sequins and tulle, strategically sheer and cut daringly low. A diamond necklace, the infamous Crystal Kiss, that had been a gossip column fixture for weeks, glittered at her throat. It was a look that screamed for attention, a stark contrast to Haylee's quiet elegance. Together, they were less a couple and more a brand launch. Haylee watched them, a strange sense of detachment washing over her. The man who had shared her bed and her dreams for 14 years looked like a stranger, a performer playing a role she no longer recognized. The sharp pain of betrayal had dulled over the months into a scar, and seeing him now didn't reopen the wound. It simply reminded her where it was. They worked the room like seasoned politicians, Daniel glad-handing a portly real estate developer, Crystal air-kissing a fashion blogger. Every few feet they would pause for a photographer, Crystal tilting her head just so Daniel's smile never faltering. Haylee turned back to the window, hoping to remain unnoticed, to simply be a ghost in the machine. But Daniel had always had a sixth sense for her presence. It was as if he had a radar for the one person in the room who wasn't captivated by his performance. She felt his eyes on her before she saw him approaching. The small crowd around him parted, and there he was, Crystal still attached to his arm, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. "Haylee," he said, his voice a smooth, deep baritone that once had the power to soothe her. Now it just sounded rehearsed. "I have to admit I'm surprised to see you here." "Daniel," she replied, her voice even. She gave a polite, distant nod to his companion. "Crystal." Crystal looked Haylee up and down. A flicker of something, was it confusion or derision, in her eyes. Haylee's simple dress was an affront to Crystal's worldview, where worth was measured in carats and couture labels. "That's a classic dress," Crystal said, the word classic sounding like an insult. "Vintage, timeless?" Haylee corrected gently, taking a small sip of her champagne. She refused to be drawn into Crystal's petty game. Haylee's always been a fan of the understated. Daniel chimed in, but his tone made it sound like a failing. He gestured around the magnificent hall. "Brings back memories, doesn't it? We ran this whole event 2 years ago, raised a record amount. I remember your seating charts were a work of art." It was a backhanded compliment designed to remind her of her former role, the helpful behind-the-scenes wife. "I remember," Haylee said, her gaze steady. "I also remember designing the lighting scheme for the exhibit that year. It won a national award." A muscle twitched in Daniel's jaw. It was a direct hit, a reminder that she was more than just a party planner. Crystal, oblivious to the undercurrent, piped up. "Greg is just so brilliant, he's a true visionary. The plans for his new building, Elysian, they're going to completely change the city. He showed me the 3D models. I get to help design the penthouse spa." She beamed as if announcing she'd solved world hunger. "I'm sure you'll bring a unique perspective," Haylee said, the very picture of polite detachment. Daniel's smirk returned. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He wanted to parade his victory, to rub her nose in everything he had taken from her and everything he had gained. "Business is booming," he said, puffing out his chest slightly. "Shaw Corp is closing a deal with a consortium from Singapore next week. Billions. Elysian is fully funded before we've even broken ground. In fact," he leaned in, lowering his voice conspiratorially, "I'm about to close a preliminary deal tonight. The biggest name in tech is here, looking to acquire the top 10 floors for his new corporate headquarters. It's all happening." He was showing off not for the crowd, but for her. He wanted to see her flinch, to see a flicker of regret or envy in her eyes. He wanted to prove that leaving her was the best business decision he'd ever made. Haylee simply listened, her expression unreadable. She felt the stares of those nearby, eavesdropping on the tense reunion. She was a curiosity, a piece of gossip made flesh. "That's wonderful for you, Daniel," she said, her voice calm and clear. "I wish you all the success you feel you deserve." The carefully chosen words hung in the air. It wasn't a blessing, it was a judgment. For the first time that evening, Daniel's mask of charming success slipped. A flash of anger, of frustration crossed his face. He had expected tears or bitterness or a desperate attempt to reconnect. He had not expected this cool, impenetrable dignity. It unnerved him. He was losing control of the scene, a situation he loathed. He decided to go for the kill. He pulled Crystal closer, planting a loud performative kiss on her cheek. "Well, we should get back to it. Important people to see. Crystal, darling, let's go talk to Bob from the Times. I want to make sure he gets a good shot of that necklace." He turned to leave, but paused, looking back at Haylee one last time. "Try to enjoy the party," he said, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "It's good for you to get out." As they walked away, a triumphant Crystal whispering in his ear, Daniel felt a surge of satisfaction. He had done it. He had faced his past and proven how much better his present was. He had shown her and everyone else that he was the victor. He had left her standing alone in the shadows, just a footnote in his grand story. He was sure of it. Haylee watched them go, the scarlet of Crystal's dress a receding beacon of vanity. She didn't feel defeated. She felt liberated. The final chain of her old life, the one that still tugged with the phantom weight of what if, had just been severed by his crass, ego-driven performance. He hadn't broken her. He had set her free. She took another sip of champagne, the bubbles a quiet celebration on her tongue, and turned back to the serenity of the view outside. A man had approached the window beside her, his presence so unobtrusive she hadn't noticed him until he spoke. "The Temple of Dendur," he said, his voice a low, pleasant baritone devoid of the aggressive bravado that filled the room. "A monument saved from the rising waters of the Nile. A beautiful metaphor, don't you think, that some things of great value are worth saving from the flood?" Haylee turned. The man was tall and lean, with kind, intelligent eyes and a subtle dusting of gray at his temples that spoke of experience, not age. He wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo, but he wore it with an ease that suggested he was comfortable in any setting. There was a quiet intensity about him, a stillness that was magnetic in the clamor of the gala. He looked vaguely familiar, but she couldn't place him. "I've always thought so," Haylee replied, drawn in by his thoughtful observation. "It's a testament to ingenuity and respect for history. So many modern builders seem to forget that." "They're too busy building monuments to themselves," the man said with a wry smile. He gestured towards the main hall. "Most of this is just ego rendered in concrete and steel." He extended a hand. "Theodore Camden." The name struck Haylee like a soft chime. Theodore Camden, the reclusive tech billionaire, the genius behind a dozen innovations that had reshaped the digital landscape. He was a legend, notoriously private, rarely photographed. He was the biggest name in tech Daniel had been boasting about. Haylee felt a jolt, but her composure held. "Haylee Vance," she said, shaking his hand. His grip was firm and warm. "I know," he said simply. His eyes held hers, and there was no pity in them, only a deep, unnerving perception. "I've been wanting to meet you. I'm a great admirer of your work." Haylee blinked. "My work. The Orion Center." He said, his gaze never wavering. "The Meridian Hotel. The initial design philosophy for the Shaw Tower before it was compromised." He said the last word with a hint of distaste. "I can see your hand in them. The harmony between form and function, the use of natural light as a building material. It's like watching a signature being written across a skyline. It's brilliant." Haylee was speechless. For years she had stood in Daniel's shadow, her contributions minimized or erased entirely. To hear this man, this titan of industry, recite her accomplishments and correctly attribute them to her was more validating than any award or public accolade. "How?" she started to ask. "I make it my business to know who the real visionaries are," Theodore explained. "Not just the ones who buy the plaques. I read an architectural journal profile on you from about 10 years ago. It stuck with me. When I heard you'd started your own firm, Vance Design, I followed the news with interest." Across the room, Daniel was holding court, laughing loudly at something a city councilman said. He glanced over, expecting to see Haylee still standing alone, a pathetic wallflower. Instead, he saw her engaged in conversation with a tall, distinguished stranger. A frown creased his brow. "Who is that?" The string quartet transitioned into a slow, elegant waltz. Theodore smiled at Haylee. "I'm not much for these events. The networking is a necessary evil. But a dance, A dance is a different kind of conversation. Haylee Vance, would you do me the honor? A genuine, unforced smile bloomed on Haley's face. It felt like the first real smile in over a year. I would be delighted, Mr. Camden. Theodore, please. He led her to the center of the floor. As he took her hand and placed his other gently on her waist, a current of warmth and surprise went through her. It had been so long since she had been held with such simple, respectful grace. As they began to dance, moving with an easy, fluid rhythm, the room began to take notice. The whispers started again, but this time they were of a different nature. Who is she dancing with? Wait, is that Theodore Camden? I thought he never came to these things. Camden dancing with Shaw's ex-wife. The news rippled through the gala like a shockwave. Daniel, in the middle of a self-aggrandizing story, heard the name Camden and froze. He turned his champagne glass halfway to his lips. He saw Haylee, a vision in emerald, gliding across the dance floor in the arms of the one man he had been desperate to impress all night. The man whose 10-floor deal was meant to be the final jewel in his crown of victory over her. The expression on Daniel's face was a stunning rapid-fire sequence of confusion, disbelief, dawning horror, and finally raw, unadulterated fury. His triumphant smirk vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed gape. Crystal, sensing his attention shift, followed his gaze. "Who's she with?" she asked, her voice shrill with indignation. "That," Daniel ground out, his knuckles white around his glass, "is my deal." On the dance floor, Haylee was oblivious to the drama she was causing. She was captivated by her conversation with Theodore. "I'm looking for a lead architect for my new foundation headquarters," Theodore was saying, his voice low and for her ears only. "A campus dedicated to sustainable technology and education. It needs to be more than a building. It needs to be a statement of purpose. It needs a soul, your kind of soul." Haley's heart soared. This wasn't just a compliment. It was the opportunity of a lifetime. A project that would not only put her back on the map, but would allow her to create something meaningful, something entirely her own. I don't know what to say," she stammered, overwhelmed. "Say you'll have lunch with me next week to discuss it," he replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners. The music swelled to a close. Theodore held her hand for a moment longer than necessary. "The flood recedes, Ms. Vance," he said softly. "The best structures remain." He escorted her off the dance floor just as Daniel, his face a thundercloud of rage, began to storm towards them, leaving a confused and irritated Crystal in his wake. Daniel saw his perfect evening, his perfect narrative, crumbling into dust. The woman he had cast aside as a relic was now the center of attention, not as a victim, but as a prize sought after by a man whose power and influence dwarfed his own. The regret that hit him was sudden and suffocating. But it wasn't for the loss of Haylee the woman. It was for the loss of an asset he had catastrophically undervalued. He hadn't just divorced his wife. He had discarded his greatest secret weapon, and she had just been deployed against him on the grandest stage imaginable. The collision was inevitable. Daniel reached them just as Theodore was bidding Haylee a polite good evening, promising his assistant would be in touch. "Camden," Daniel boomed, forcing a jovial tone that was painfully transparent. He clapped a hand on Theodore's shoulder, a gesture of faux camaraderie. "Daniel Shaw. We haven't been formally introduced. I was hoping to catch you tonight." Theodore Camden subtly shifted, dislodging Daniel's hand. He regarded Daniel with a cool, appraising look that could freeze fire. "Mr. Shaw, I know who you are." There was no warmth in the acknowledgement. "Great, great." Daniel pressed on, sweat beading on his brow. He gestured vaguely between Haylee and Theodore. "I see you've met my ex-wife, Haylee. She was quite the decorator in her day." The words were meant to diminish her, to relegate her back to the role of a hobbyist in Theodore's eyes. Theodore's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened. "Ms. Vance is not a decorator, Mr. Shaw. She is an architect of rare talent. I've been following her career, her real career, for years." The public correction delivered in Theodore's quiet but authoritative voice was a slap in the face. A few people nearby who had been watching the drama unfold exchanged glances. Daniel's face flushed a deep, mottled red. He tried to recover, turning his attention back to the deal. "Well, that's history. The future is what's exciting, Elysian. I believe my office sent over the portfolio for the corporate leasing opportunity. 10 floors of the most advanced commercial real estate on the planet." "I saw it," Theodore said flatly. "And I'll be candid with you, Mr. Shaw. The design is uninspired. It's a gaudy monument to ego with poor environmental integration and a stunning lack of humanity. It's precisely the kind of empty spectacle I'm not interested in." He then turned his full, charming attention back to Haylee. "Ms. Vance, it was a true pleasure. I look forward to our lunch." With a final polite nod to Haylee and a complete dismissal of Daniel, Theodore Camden turned and walked away, melting back into the crowd as quietly as he had appeared. The silence he left behind was deafening. Daniel stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape. He had been publicly, surgically, and utterly humiliated. Not only had he lost the deal of a lifetime, but he had lost it to the woman he'd just belittled, who had apparently earned the billionaire's respect on her own merit. Crystal finally caught up her scarlet dress, looking cheap and garish under the suddenly harsh lights. "What happened? What did he say?" she demanded, tugging on his arm. Daniel shook her off, his eyes wild with fury fixed on Haylee. "You—" he seethed, his voice a venomous whisper. "You did this. You planned this. You set me up." Haylee looked at him, at the paranoid, desperate man he had become, and felt nothing but a profound sense of pity. "Daniel, the world doesn't revolve around you," she said, her voice weary. "Some things happen because of merit, not malice. Now, if you'll excuse me, this evening has been far more interesting than I anticipated, but I believe it's over." She turned and walked away, not with a triumphant flourish, but with the simple, quiet dignity of someone who had nothing left to prove. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The society pages the next day weren't about Daniel and Crystal's grand entrance. They were dominated by a single grainy photo of Theodore Camden dancing with a mysterious, elegant woman in emerald. The columns buzzed with speculation. Who was Haylee Vance? What was her connection to the reclusive billionaire? In an instant, Haylee was transformed from a pitiable divorcee into an intriguing and powerful figure. The story of Theodore's public dressing down of Daniel Shaw spread like wildfire through the city's financial and real estate circles. Confidence in Daniel, which was largely built on bluster and perceived momentum, began to erode. The Singaporean consortium, already having quiet doubts about the Elysian project's soaring budget and soulless design, heard the story. A man who couldn't recognize the talent in his own house for 14 years was perhaps not the visionary they should be betting billions on. A week later, they quietly pulled their funding, citing market uncertainties. Daniel's empire began to crack. Subcontractors got nervous about being paid. His lines of credit tightened. He was a shark that had to keep moving forward, and he had just been stopped dead in the water. His relationship with Crystal, a union built on the unstable foundation of success and publicity, began to crumble under the pressure. The lavish gifts slowed. The fawning press disappeared, replaced by articles questioning the viability of the Elysian project. Crystal's brand was tied to his success, and his success was evaporating. The arguments became frequent and vicious. "This is your fault," she shrieked at him one night in the now cavernous penthouse, waving her phone, which showed a new article about Haylee Vance's design being courted for a major project. "You made me look like an idiot. You told me she was a nobody. Now she's the one everyone is talking about, and I'm stuck here with you and your failing building." The regret that consumed Daniel was a bitter, acidic thing. He saw it all so clearly now. Haylee had been his partner, his compass, his source of true creative power. He had thrown it all away for a cheap thrill, for a vapid ego boost. He hadn't just lost a wife. He had amputated the best part of himself. He would call her late at night, his voice thick with whiskey and desperation. "Haylee, we can fix this," he'd slur into her voicemail. "I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. It was always you. We were a team. I need you." Haylee would listen to the messages in the quiet of her apartment, not with anger, but with a sad finality. He didn't miss her. He missed what she did for him. He missed her talent, her stability, her quiet strength that made his loud weaknesses seem less glaring. He didn't want a partner. He wanted a ghostwriter for his life. And he was finally realizing he couldn't write a single compelling sentence on his own. She never called back. She was too busy drafting the future. A year can change a skyline. More than that, a year can change a life. The autumn air, crisp and smelling of distant rain, was sharp on Haylee's face as she stood on the exposed 20th floor of what was becoming the Camden Foundation for Sustainable Futures. The roar of the city below was a distant rhythmic pulse, a backdrop to the more immediate symphony of her new world, the percussive clang of steel on steel, the whine of a power saw, the coordinated shouts of the construction crew. This was a sound she had once loved, then lost, and now reclaimed as her own. She wore a white hard hat, her name Vance, stenciled neatly on the side, and a thick, practical jacket over her clothes. A roll of blueprints was tucked securely under her arm. "The glazing for the west atrium is arriving an hour ahead of schedule." Ms. Vance called out Frank, the burly site foreman, his voice a gravelly, respectful rumble. He jogged over holding a tablet displaying a logistics chart. "The crane's free. Want us to start hoisting or stick to the original timeline?" Haylee unrolled a section of her blueprint on a nearby stack of plywood, her gloved finger tracing a complex series of lines. "Let's start now, Frank. The weather report shows high winds moving in after 3. I want that curtain wall secure before then. Make sure the gaskets are double-checked. The temperature differential on that side will be significant." "You got it," he said with a nod of absolute confidence. He'd been skeptical of her at first, another starchitect with fancy ideas. But after a month of her practical on-the-ground problem-solving and an encyclopedic knowledge of load-bearing capacities, he'd become her most vocal champion. She didn't just design, she knew how to build. She watched him go, a deep, quiet satisfaction settling in her chest. This was where she belonged. Not in a ballroom, not at a charity luncheon, but here amidst the dust and the noise, turning vision into reality. Further downtown, another very different structure scarred the skyline. The Elysian Project, Daniel Shaw's would-be monument to himself, stood as a skeletal ruin. Its steel beams, already showing the first faint blush of rust, were a stark monument to his hubris, wrapped in tattered plastic sheeting that snapped and billowed in the wind like tormented ghosts. The project was a carcass picked clean by lawyers and creditors. Daniel's name, once a seal of success, was now a punchline in the industry. And Crystal, whose entire identity had been a reflection of his success, had vanished at the first sign of a shadow, her social media presence pivoting seamlessly to a crypto millionaire in Miami, all traces of her life with Daniel scrubbed clean. A familiar voice cut through the noise of the site. Thinking about the competition, Haylee turned, a genuine smile spreading across her face. Theodore Camden stood there holding 2 steaming cups of coffee, looking perfectly at ease in his tailored wool coat amidst the raw construction. He navigated the rebar and cables with the same confidence he navigated a boardroom. Hardly, Haylee replied, accepting a cup. The warmth seeped into her cold hands. "I was thinking about thermal expansion joints." He laughed, a rich, genuine sound that always seemed to warm her. "Of course you were." He stood beside her, looking out at the sprawling city. "Frank tells me you're already a legend with the crew. Says he'd follow you into any architectural battle." "Frank just appreciates that I know the difference between a truss and a trestle," she said with a shrug, but she was pleased. Their relationship had grown organically from the seed of mutual respect planted that night at the gala. It was a partnership of equals, a quiet and powerful love built not on grand gestures, but on shared passions and late-night conversations about everything from urban planning to ancient philosophy. He celebrated her triumphs as if they were his own, and listened to her frustrations with an insightful patience she'd never known. He loved her for the intricate, brilliant workings of her mind, not for the reflection she cast upon him. "It's going to be magnificent," he said, his gaze sweeping over the rising structure, then coming to rest on her face. "We still have a long way to go," she murmured, her eyes following the arc of a crane as it began to lift a massive panel of glass into the sky. "All the best things do," he replied, his hand finding hers, their fingers lacing together in a gesture of simple, profound intimacy. Later that day, Haylee was at the new offices of Vance Design. The cramped walk-up was a distant memory. Her firm now occupied 2 floors of a beautifully restored building in Soho, the space itself a testament to her design philosophy, all clean lines, natural materials, and abundant light. The main studio was a hive of creative energy. 15 architects and designers, a mix of seasoned veterans and bright young talents, were bent over drafting tables and computer monitors. Penelope, now Chief Operating Officer, orchestrated the chaos with her trademark fiery efficiency. Haylee moved through the space, a leader in her element. She paused to help a junior designer resolve a tricky sightline issue, made a quick decision on a stone sample for a new gallery project, and approved a set of final drawings for a client. She was no longer a ghost. She was a gravitational center pulling together talent and opportunity, building a legacy that was entirely her own. Driving home as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the avenues, her car was stopped in traffic. On the seat beside her lay the preliminary sketches for a new performing arts center, a project she had just won against 3 of the biggest firms in the country. She was idly looking out the window when she saw him. Daniel. He was walking down the sidewalk, hunched against the wind. The impeccably tailored suits were gone, replaced by a rumpled, ill-fitting overcoat that looked a size too big for his diminished frame. His confident, world-conquering stride had been ground down into a defeated shuffle. His hair was unkempt, his face pallid. He was just another anonymous man in a sea of anonymous faces, a king dethroned, wandering the streets of a kingdom that no longer recognized him. For a moment he was just that, a stranger. Then he looked up, and his gaze swept across the line of cars, and his eyes, dull and empty, a second before locked with hers. The world seemed to fall silent. In that single frozen moment she saw it all in his face. The shock of recognition, the shame, the crushing weight of 1,000 squandered yesterdays. She saw the ghost of the man she had once loved, and the pathetic shell of the man who had torn her life apart. The desperate, bottomless regret in his eyes was a chasm. A year ago, seeing him like this might have sparked a flare of triumph, a bitter taste of victory. But now Haylee felt nothing of the sort. There was no anger, no satisfaction. There was only a profound, quiet sense of finality. He was no longer a villain in her story. He was just a postscript. He had no more power over her. The rage and the grief he had caused had been transformed, recycled into the steel and mortar of her new life. He took a half-step toward the street as if he might call out to her, a drowning man reaching for the ship that had long since sailed. Haylee held his gaze. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a gesture of forgiveness nor of pity. It was one of closure, an acknowledgement of a past that was truly irrevocably past. A final silent goodbye. The light changed. The car horn behind her beeped once softly. She took her foot off the brake and the car moved forward, accelerating smoothly into the flow of traffic. In her rear-view mirror she saw his image shrink, becoming smaller and smaller, until he was just an indistinct shape absorbed back into the crowd. She didn't look again. She was Haylee Vance. She was not the ex-wife, the victim, or the footnote. She was the architect, and as she drove towards the rising sun of her own future, she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she was finally gloriously designing a life entirely of her own. The blueprints were hers. The foundation was strong, and the view from the top was more beautiful than she had ever dared to imagine. Haylee's story isn't just about revenge. It's about reclamation. It's about a woman who was told her worth was tied to a man, only to discover that her true value was in her own hands, her own mind, and her own unbreakable spirit. She didn't need a billionaire to save her, but his respect helped her remember how to save herself. She walked through the fire of a devastating betrayal and didn't just survive. She used the ashes to build an empire of her own design. Her victory wasn't just in winning, it was in realizing she was never playing his game to begin with. If Haylee's journey from the ashes of a painful past to the blueprint of a brilliant future inspired you, please let us know. These are the stories we love to share. Tales of resilience, empowerment, and the quiet triumph of substance over spectacle. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder of their own strength, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that will move and inspire you. Thank you for listening.